PR Done and Dunner. I am your host, Bob Geller. Today we'll discuss company brands, executive brands. What do they mean? How are they measured? What's the interplay between them? Can having a highly visible rock star CEO who is emblematic of the company help or hurt? To answer these questions, we invited an expert in the field to join. He's had an illustrious and successful career in comms before co-founding Calber, a Danish brand and reputation analytics firm. Please welcome Calber CEO, Shahar Silbershatz. Welcome to the podcast, Shahar. How are you?
Thanks, Bob. I'm good. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. I was wondering, I think it provided good context for the topic at hand to get right to directly what you do, what the company does, its methods, its technology, if you use technology.
Sure thing. So Calber is a stakeholder intelligence platform. So what we do, we provide a real-time dashboard for our customers who tend to be corporate communicators and marketers with brand and reputation metrics that get updated in real time. So it's an always-on continuous tracker of perceptions, and it's based on surveys that we conduct online every day across around 50 plus countries. So the idea, of course, is to give our customers a sense of what people think about them, how they perceive them, what is the impact of the activities that they do, and what is the impact of external events, so that they can better inform their communications and marketing activities, their stakeholder engagement activities, and so on.
That makes sense. Who do you survey?
So we survey, typically we use panels for that, and we use general public panels. So we would survey basically anybody, all people, all walks of life. But of course, when we survey people and ask them for their opinions of companies, we want to make sure that they're sufficiently informed of those companies. So we screen people by their level of familiarity with those companies. And then, of course, we dive into different segments within the panel. So we would also look at perceptions of customers, of potential employees, relevant talent, opinion leaders, influencers, journalists, investors, analysts, regulators, policymakers, and so on. So it's a mix in a sense of everybody, but we start out with a general public panel and then we drill down.
I see. So do you have to recruit these panelists? Do you have a database? Do you use somebody else's database?
We use somebody else's panels, which are, as you say, a database. So we work with research vendors around the world. We have a few partners that cover the whole world for us, and they have large panel books, large panels of respondents who sign up and agree to be invited to do these online surveys. So we don't have to recruit them ourselves. Our survey platform is basically plugged into those research vendors' databases so that we can invite their people to our surveys.
Sounds great. How long have you folks been doing this?
Been doing it for about 6 years now.
That's great. What kinds of clients? Who are your clients? What kind of clients do you have?
So it tends to be large enterprises, typically multinationals, but also domestic players. We started out in Denmark and originally had Danish and Nordic clients, then expanded into Germany and UK and the rest of Europe, and then also to the US and Brazil. So the companies, our clients are typically, they operate in sectors that are perhaps more regulated or more scrutinized, where they want to pay more attention to their reputation and stakeholder perception. So that could be financial services or pharmaceutical, energy companies, also FMCG, automotive, aerospace. So those are some of the sectors, also tech. Those are some of the sectors that we tend to have as clients. So it can be, we work with Coca-Cola in the US, we work with Airbus in France, we work with Audi in Germany. We work with, those type of companies around the world, Electrolux, Ericsson, Eon, all kinds of typically either regional or multinational players within those sectors.
So they tend to be large enterprises versus SMBs or startups, correct?
Correct. And the reason is that, one, we need those companies to be highly familiar so that we can actually have people that are sufficiently familiar with them, but also because those typically are the companies that have corporate communication departments and actually pay attention to reputation and use reputation measurement tools.
I see. No, that makes a lot of sense. Do you ever study issues versus brands and names?
For sure, yeah. So we look at, because we have this access to a whole lot of data, perception data, and because we have full control over the interviews, the surveys that we conduct, we often ask other questions to understand different patterns and trends that are happening. We ask people different questions with regards to their general attitude to certain things, industry issues. We often ask about industry issues, what people really want companies to address in specific sectors or in general, people's general optimism regarding the economy and different topics. Of course, sustainability comes up quite a lot. Within certain sectors, let's say the automotive, it can be electrification. Within energy, it can be the green transformation. So a lot of these topics also come up, and we try to understand what people are expecting in general from businesses. And then sometimes we do something a little bit unusual, like we did here, where we look at the reputation of CEOs as well.
That sounds great. So could you do me a favor? I mean, everybody, let's face it, everybody who's out there marketing a company who wants to have a brand or has a brand wants to take the pulse, the temperature of that brand. And there's different ways of doing that. So could you compare and contrast what you do versus, say, those who attempt to look at online reputation, or also I think some are familiar with the Q score? How are you different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we come, the founders, me and the others, we come from, I would say, the research side of reputation. So we used to do these traditional research studies. Once a year, we would do an annual stakeholder study for a company. And that's a pretty large exercise. It takes a long time, pretty expensive. And by the time you get the results, it's a few months later because you've conducted a whole lot of interviews, sometimes face-to-face, phone interviews. Took a while to recruit people. And we realize over time that's not very actionable because if you come back with once a year with some results, it's very hard to understand why scores went up or down and what the company is doing to actually trigger loss of trust or gain of trust. So that's one of the other alternatives is using traditional research, either quarterly or annually or ad hoc, but the lack of continuity makes it very non-actionable. And this is why we're doing it differently on a daily basis. But then, of course, as you said, a lot of companies use different online tools. And there's a lot of those that you can use and it can be cheaper and faster. And of course, social listening is quite popular today. So there's a lot of that going on. And there you can actually get a much more real-time sense of what people say is your reputation. We would argue it's not really your reputation. If you're scraping the web or if you're listening to people on social media, you're picking up the vocal people. You're not necessarily listening to the right people. Those are not your people who represent your stakeholder universe. So the data is not necessarily accurate or representative. And in that sense, it cannot really form a very solid and statistically valued KPI. So what we're trying to do is to focus on something that is statistically a lot more robust, a lot more stable, and a lot more representative of your stakeholder universe.
Right. And of course, there's always the chance that they're looking at the activity of bots or maybe disinformation campaigns. So
yeah, that's another issue that's cropped up recently, that when you start scraping and listening, sometimes more and more you pick up basically fake voices, you pick up bots, and it's very hard to tell online in using those social media channels or other online channels. It's very hard to tell what's real and what's not. Whereas if you interview real people and you know those people exist because they've been verified and quality assured by the panel providers, you actually can verify that there's a physical person behind it, and you can do a lot more quality assurance on that.
That makes a lot of sense. It's signal versus noise, and I think I agree. There's no substitute for a real survey. And the more frequent, the better, as you folks do. But stepping back then and looking at the topic at hand, we actually met through PR. What a concept! I first heard of your work by reading a CNN story. And what it has said essentially was that while some may perceive the recent poor performance of Tesla as related to a downturn in the EV market, it's actually the opposite, that Tesla is being a drag on the market. And further, there could be a connection between Tesla's problems and the reputation of its infamous leader, Elon Musk. And it cited data from Calber to make this argument. Do I have this right so far?
Yeah, you do.
Is there anything maybe you can share with the audience just a bit more about the survey, what it revealed, and what we can conclude from it?
So this was it came out of a bit unexpectedly. It came out of one of our thought leadership initiatives. So because we're sitting on so much data, running these interviews, we have millions of data points accumulating all the time across the whole world of what a lot of people think about a lot of companies and a lot of topics, and then we often use that data to detect these patterns or tell interesting stories as basis for our thought leadership. And in December, we had this idea that it would be interesting to also check the reputation of some high profile or visible CEOs and compare that to the reputation of their companies and see if there's any link that we can detect. And we decided to go for the tech sector in the US because that's a pretty visible sector with very, I would say, kind of almost celebrity branded, CEOs in the tech industry in the US. So we basically did a short study where we asked people about a range of CEOs and also wanted to. So we asked a lot of questions. We can go more into details, but some of the things that we basically realized is that there is some connection in some cases between CEO reputations and their respective companies' reputation. And of course, that was the case for Elon Musk more than others. So he had a very low reputation, and the patterns, the different indicators within the reputation reflected the pattern of Tesla's and more so Twitter's reputation or X's reputation. So that was kind of interesting. And then we published an article about that and also pitched it to some media outlets. And there was a Reuters reporter that was writing at the time, that was back in December, Jan. She was writing about the drop in sales of Teslas in California. And she thought it was interesting, that piece of information, and she used it. Then, of course, she came back to us in March because at that point, everybody was talking about Tesla's, commercial downturn. And she wanted more data from us because we're tracking things continuously. And she wanted to know, are we actually seeing that downturn reputationally as well, which we were. And we provided some more data, and she put it into an article suggesting that it's potentially Musk's reputation that's dragging down Tesla's reputation. And the data was definitely there to establish that. So then she wrote a piece about that got picked up by a lot of outlets, including CNN.
Well, I guess you can connect it. I mean, if you ask the right question, you can ask people if Elon Musk's reputation is holding people back from buying one of his cars, I guess. It's causation versus, association, right? So you can't always.
Yeah. It's a tricky thing, right? Because there's a correlation is not causation, as everybody knows, and sometimes when you see similar patterns, it doesn't mean that one is causing the other. But there were a few telltale signs, like for example, X's reputation or Twitter's reputation has taken a dive after Musk has taken over. That was very clear from our data. We've been tracking it for a while. We could also see that even though we didn't have continuous data on Musk, we had continuous data on the companies. For the CEOs, we just did kind of an ad hoc study back in December, but we could also see if we split the data by demographics and political affiliations and other characteristics, we could see that there's similar splits. So for example, Musk is more popular among Republicans than Democrats, and we can see some similar patterns happening with Twitter, which were different to how Twitter was before. So we could see that there's definitely an impact of the CEO on the company,
Wow.
Not the other way around, right?
That's
and of course, it's easy in the case of Musk because he's also been very vocal and visible around it, and also very controversial. So we don't actually ask people, do you like this company or not because of the CEO? The first thing we ask is, do you even know whose company this person is the CEO of? And by the way, most people don't know for most of the CEOs. It's only Musk and Zuckerberg that people can actually connect with their companies. The rest, people just don't know.
That's a good point. Well, like I said, everyone in this audience likely loves a good PR story. And folks, we're talking now about how the sausage gets made here. Pay close attention. I mean, it's a good way to start. Reuters and CEN, and I'm assuming you had other media hits from all this. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, our clients, and I'm sure others who are watching, sometimes have survey information or data from their systems, maybe that they want to package into a media pitch. Can you share more about it? It seems like you're very highly successful. I think you call it a content marketing operation. Can you share anything at all about what you folks do or how
So when it comes to using our data for content, which is what we do all the time because we are a data company, what we try to do, so there's data that's interesting for our customers, of course, and that's what we focus on. But as we collect data for our customers, We also notice things that are happening in an industry, or we also notice impact of geopolitical events or macro events, and those have an appeal to a wider audience. So these are the things when we know, okay, this could be interesting
Oh,
for the public, and this could become something that we publish or that we pitch to the media. So what we try to do as we collect data, we try to identify different trends or different patterns that we think will have a wider appeal. And that's what we try to pitch. So it has to be very timely. It has to relate to something that's happening. For example, when the Ukraine war started, when COVID happened, these things have a massive impact also on companies' reputations. So we try to understand what are those impacts, and that becomes very interesting for the public beyond our customer universe, and that's what we try to pitch. Also, when you have very high-profile crises or things that are happening for a certain company. I mean, last year there was the auto workers union strike in the U.S. That had a massive impact on reputation of automotive
oh,
companies here. That's something that we also pitched to the media because it was timely, it was interesting, and it had a wider appeal. So I think for us the secret sauce, so to speak, and we don't always get it right. By the way, this one was really a nice success story. But for us, the recipe is to try to detect, okay, which data points could be interesting for something that's happening right now that has a wide appeal, and let's tell a good story around that.
sounds like a newsjacking campaign on steroids. I mean, we do newsjacking. It takes 5 minutes. It's probably much more complicated the way you folks do it. Can you quickly get the results you need to jump on a story?
Yeah, and that's the benefit, of course, of having an always-on system. So we can use
Um,
Jack and we can get very quick data if we want to, if something's happening. It's not always easy because you also want the data to be statistically valid. You have to make sure that you're not giving out something that's too rash and not based on sufficient samples. But yeah, we try to do some news jacking when we can, but sometimes we also try to tell bigger stories, right? The anniversary of the Ukraine war that just happened a couple of months ago, the second anniversary for us was an opportunity to look at how has this affected in the longer term companies' reputations, the companies' decisions, action or inaction around the Ukraine war. How has that affected them? So that's not so much newsjacking. I mean, it's a little bit, right? Because people talk about the second anniversary, people talk about the war. We're trying to take a bigger picture
sure.
and actually enrich the debate around that.
And it's proactive and planned versus very reactive. You know it's coming up and you can plan for
Exactly.
that. Um, but I think we need one of these for sure at Fusion PR. We need this. But looking at journalists, I mean, do they ever request a custom slice of data? Do journalists ever put you to work and say, if you'd had this, you know?
Yeah, we get some of that. I mean, I think the thing, you know it better than me, that the thing with journalists is that they get bombarded with pitches and they also get a lot of free data. So coming to them and saying, "Hey, I have this free data for you," it's not as appealing anymore. I think we don't
Yeah,
often hear back when we do that. So sometimes we kind of need to strike a relationship or say something that's interesting enough, and then we might get a comeback saying, "Okay, can you actually tell me more?" Because that would be interesting if I could know something else. And we also got it a little bit around the tech CEO study that we did. Some companies were asking, well, how about some competitors that are not American? How does that reflect there? And we do sometimes get questions where they ask us for more data, and in some cases we're happy to generate it too, because again, it's easy for us to generate data very quickly. So
yeah,
sometimes we do that, but I think the trick is to really get their attention, and then have a dialogue and then see if we can give more data that would be interesting for them. No, we don't get that much, but we try.
yeah. I mean, some of the knock against surveys, I think it's the ultimate thing, really understanding perceptions, attitudes, but some think it's very expensive. Have you, I don't know, what would you say to that?
So that's obviously changed now because certainly the way that we do it is automated and it's all online, it's all quantitative. So those are short interviews. They are it is a commodity business. If you look at our panel providers, having panels and paying for interviews has become a lot cheaper than it was in the past. And if we have a setup, if you have a setup like we do, where a lot of the work is automated around it, actually generating data based on surveys is much cheaper than it used to be.
Interesting. Yeah. Are you ever worried about any blowback from folks who didn't get a good score? Now you're putting them in the media about that?
You mean if we tell negative stories of other companies and then I might come back and
Well, I'm thinking to something that I was going to get into in a moment, but it's the In Tech We Trust blog post where you had obviously extensive research about what maybe a dozen CEOs,
Yeah.
and not all of it was rosy.
No, no, that's right. Well, we always say don't kill the messenger, right? I mean,
Good point.
we're giving unbiased data here. We're asking other people. These are not our opinions. We can always interpret the data based on what we know. Do we get blowback? Sometimes companies don't like what we write about them, and when we write, we try to be fair. We don't knock people down or companies down. We're basically saying this is what this company is experiencing. Sometimes there's also a good story of how a company recovered from a crisis, or what we think could help the company based on the drivers or the levers that we're seeing. So in a sense, we are the messenger, and we try to help uh, companies and also the media with data that can give more factual information.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. That's great. So, having said all this, and obviously you studied this area well, what do you think is a net positive and net negative having a very highly visible CEO that's singularly associated with a company? Um, should you kind of
So
share?
it's
Mhm.
I think in the past it probably used to be more positive than it is today. I mean, when you think about the Richard Bransons and the Steve Jobs of the world, you used to have these superstar CEOs whose halo basically
Mhm.
rubbed off on the company, and I think today it's different. I would say today it's probably a liability to have a highly visible CEO. Of course, I'm not talking about specific stakeholders like investors or journalists. They want to see the CEO more visible, and they are perhaps a more informed stakeholder group. But if you talk about the public in general, um, today it's very tricky because being visible often means pissing somebody off. I mean, it's a highly polarized world today. So if you're
Yeah,
highly visible, and if you're talking about social political issues, then you're gonna polarize people to some extent, and that's also what I mentioned before. We're seeing a lot of polarization in the results. So if you're highly visible, then you're more likely to be connected to your company. If you're highly visible, you're likely to talk about controversial issues. Hence, you're likely to negatively impact the company.
yeah. I mean, how can you avoid controversial issues? It seems you almost have a responsibility if you're out there very public. If you're not talking about these things, if you are talking about these things, you can get in a lot of trouble. As you said, it's a polarized world. Um, Public discourse, especially online, has gotten very poisonous and reactive, and so it's challenging. It's a challenging time to be out there, and in the public eye, no question about it. One other question, or a couple other questions, maybe. I want to talk more about this "In Tech We Trust" blog post, which I'll put a link in the show notes. But that seems like fairly extensive research into the world of tech, and a lot of folks in our audience are in tech marketing and from the
Mm.
tech sector. So, is there anything you wanted to say about that study?
Well, the tech sector has its own problems. I guess before we get to the CEO part, big tech has been taking a lot of flack over the last few years around data privacy and
Mm,
and, and all kinds of issues. Um, and I think that's something that we've been noticing for a while, that the tech industry used to be very, very highly reputable. We look at many sectors. We track also sectors, not just companies, and we track about 16 sectors. And the tech sector used to be fairly favorable in terms of public opinion compared to sectors like banking and pharma and chemicals, telecom, that were more scrutinized and less favorable. But what's happened, especially because of big tech over the last few years, is that suddenly you have questions of regulation and questions of, is the industry actually living up to its role, because it's becoming much, much stronger. And you could see from the data that opinions are becoming more split, and people are becoming more negative about the sector in general. Um, then when it comes to the CEOs, what's interesting is that almost all the we I think surveyed around, we asked people's opinions around about, I think, around 10 CEOs, 10 companies and 10 CEOs. And I think in most cases, the CEOs had a lower reputation than their company.
well,
So almost consistently, the personalities had a worse reputation, a lower trust and like score. This is how we use as a proxy, a measurement for reputation, is to what extent people trust and like you. the reputation score, the trust and like score, was lower for the CEOs. There were a couple of exceptions around that. I think Uber was one exception, and I think Alphabet was another exception, where the CEO actually had a better reputation than the company. But for all the others, it was the opposite. So that first of all suggests that this is the first reason why it's a problem being a visible CEO in the tech sector, because apparently people don't like them much. But we could also see that it's when it comes to the tech sector, and again, a leader of an Alphabet is not the same as a leader of a scale up, right? So of course, you have to think about the distinction between based on the size of your company and what exactly you do within tech. It's not the same for everybody, but I would say that there are certain leaders whose reputation was very, very negative, like Jeff Bezos has a very low reputation.
That surprised me, by the way, because he hasn't gotten himself in a lot of obvious trouble like some of the others. But there you have it.
And that's very interesting. But the real difference here, as opposed to Zuckerberg and Musk and some of the others, is that the reputation of Amazon is stellar. I mean, they have a very, very high trust and like score in the US. So there's a big gap between how
Ask people who work there, by the way.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Let's not even go there. But
okay.
But there's a massive gap between the reputation of Amazon and the reputation of Jeff Bezos. And actually, a lot of Americans, 44% to be exact, do actually connect Bezos and Amazon. So it's not an issue of people don't connect the two, because for a lot of the other companies, that's the issue. Here, that's not the issue. So what we ended up concluding is that Jeff Bezos is apparently not liked very much, not because of controversial statements or opinions that he's voiced, but probably because of other personal reasons. It could be his high-profile divorce. It could be the fact that he has made so much money, maybe accumulated too much power, but it's not stuff that's directly connected to the company. It's not voicing opinions that make people connect that with the company and what the company is thinking or doing. And in that sense, his negative reputation hasn't rubbed off on the company. So sometimes, even if you are visible, it's better to be visible around areas that are not directly connected to your company. Again, when it comes to the public, not when it comes to your investors. And in that sense, you kind of shield a little bit the company from yourself.
I guess so, but then in that case, maybe you're seen more as a hands-off executive, and they talk more about your personal life versus what's happening with the company.
Could be, and I don't want people to draw a conclusion that a CEO needs to be, kind of fly under the radar and be very low profile, because I think a visible CEO, or at least a CEO who stands behind a company's purpose and behind what the company is doing, is typically a positive thing. It's positive when it comes to employees. It's positive when it comes to talent. Positive when it comes to B2B stakeholders, people who might be working with you, suppliers or customers or prospects. So I think a visible CEO is important. And I think it's especially important if you want to showcase what you're doing, what you're saying, and show that the leader is standing behind that. So I wouldn't say that it's a bad thing to be at the front of the company. I would just say that when it comes to the public at large, if you're going to take a public stance or public opinion and going to put yourself out there, you have to watch out what you talk about and make sure you don't get into any controversy that's connected to your company.
That makes a lot of sense. And when I was asking for, I wasn't just asking with regard to a highly visible CEO, but maybe sharing the wealth amongst your bench of other C-level execs and letting them get out there and also be associated with the company. Not just having, the question was also about just having one executive that's singly associated with that company, and whether that's a good thing or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's pros and cons, of course. If you have one executive that's associated with the company, then, because people are prone to make mistakes, right? So they're human. So you always have the risk if a company is too much associated with a person that it can do something positive for the company. It can also do something negative. I think in general, you want your leadership to be visible. You want to have it dispersed as much as possible, and you want to put forward the right spokespersons. So, for example, we had a case of a client who's a pharmaceutical company that was very much in the news with a lot of scrutiny during COVID, one of the COVID vaccine manufacturers, and the CEO was a very polarizing figure. I mean, they put him out in public many times to talk about the issue, and he didn't do a good job at it. He actually hurt the company's reputation quite a lot. So then they looked at the data and they realized, okay, he should probably not be the spokesperson around this issue. We should probably put forward some scientists to talk about a bit more the science and the technical
Makes
aspect
sense.
rather than the CEO. And those scientists did a much better job at being the spokesperson. So I think it's sometimes also dependent on the situation.
Right. Well, this is fantastic. It's really useful information that I think our audience is going to appreciate. Anything else you'd like to add, Shahar? You think we covered it pretty well?
We covered it pretty well. I think reputation is a bit fickle, right? I mean, it's a tricky area because they say that it takes a long time to build it, and you can lose it in 5 minutes. I think we live in the world we live in today is very different from a reputation perspective, from many perspectives, than the world we lived in 20, 30 years ago. And I think the problem today is there's constantly crises happening. There's constantly things happening in the world that are affecting how people view you as a company. 20 years ago, if there was a war somewhere, that didn't really affect how people see you. If there was a legislation in some country, that didn't really affect about social issues. That didn't affect you as a company. Today, it does. So everything that's happening today affects you as a company, as a business, if you're a big business. So I think the important thing, if I leave you with one thought, or your listeners with one thought, is that you have to be very very much attuned to what's happening in the world around you, even if it has nothing to do with your business or your sector, because you're required to have an opinion about a lot of things. You're basically looked up to and listened to when it comes to your opinions on wider issues, and you have to take action when it comes to different geopolitical events. And that's very, very tricky because you can very easily annoy people or make mistakes or say the wrong thing. So it's a world where you have to be a lot more, I would say, careful, but also pretty fast to react to what's happening rather than try to keep a low profile, because that's also not a good strategy.
Brilliant insight. You know what all that means is that you have to have a great comms team around you too, right?
Exactly. And a good reputation measurement tool.
Yeah, there you go. On that note, we'll leave it, I guess. I'll leave your information in the show notes so people know how to find you. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Shahar, for sharing your insight with the audience and joining the podcast, and look forward to staying in touch. Take care.
Yeah, me too. Thanks a lot, Bob. Take care.
Thank you.